April 30th, 2026. James Broadnax, with a sworn confession from the alleged actual shooter, DNA evidence that pointed away from him, and the support of over 60 religious leaders, was still carried out for execution by the state of Texas. No delay, no second chance, just one word from the Supreme Court that afternoon: denied. James Broadnax had spent 17 years on death row waiting for someone in power to stop and say, wait. He had gotten married just 2 weeks before this day. He had prayed for the victims' families every single day, and by 6:47 that evening, minutes before 7 p.m. in Huntsville, Texas, it was over. His last words to the world were calm, firm, and final. And once you hear what he said, this story will not leave you easily. There is something about a final morning that no words can fully hold. April 30th began for James Broadnax inside the same walls, under the same lights, with the same silence that had surrounded him for nearly 2 decades. But this morning carried a different weight, and everyone around him felt it. His legal team had spent the night preparing what they knew could be the last appeal his case would ever see. Built around a sworn confession from his cousin Demarius Cummings, who had come forward just weeks earlier and stated under oath that he was the one who pulled the trigger, not James. Courts ultimately did not accept these claims as sufficient grounds to halt the execution, but that morning the filing was still in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and James Broadnax was in his cell waiting to find out if any of it mattered. His attorneys described him in those final days as someone maintaining faith and stoicism. A man who still believed, even then, that his case would have a chance to be heard. He was not pacing. He was not unraveling. He was waiting with the kind of quiet that only comes from someone who has spent 17 years learning how to hold themselves together when the walls keep closing in. Outside those walls, people were still fighting for him. Inside them, James Broadnax was doing the only thing left that he could do, waiting for a phone call that would decide everything. And that phone call, or rather what came instead of it, arrived by the afternoon. What the system's final decision did to everyone in that building is the kind of moment that does not make it into official records. But what the system ignored, what no one expected from James himself, and what happened inside those walls as the hours counted down, that is where this story truly lives. The answer came in the afternoon. The U.S. Supreme Court denied James Broadnax's final appeal. Years of legal work collapsed into a single word: denied. There were no more courts above that one, no more arguments to make, no more waiting for a different answer from a higher authority, because there was no higher authority left. The execution remained scheduled for that evening, and nothing had changed that. Authorities maintained throughout that the conviction was legally sound and had been reviewed through the proper channels. His legal team, however, believed the courts had never fully examined what the new evidence truly meant. That disagreement did not matter anymore. The afternoon of April 30th made sure of that. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had previously ruled that the confession-based claims should have been raised in earlier filings. The Board of Pardons and Paroles had denied clemency, and now the Supreme Court has spoken. For the people who had spent years alongside James Broadnax, this was the moment every fear they had ever carried became a certainty. And then the decision reached James himself. Somewhere in Huntsville, a 37-year-old man found out that the last door was shut. What the system could not have scripted, what no one in that building expected, was the composure he showed when that news arrived. Because the man who received it, and the man who walked into that chamber later that evening, was not who most people imagine when they picture someone on death row. What his life had quietly become inside those walls is the detail that changes how you see everything that came after. By the time April 30th arrived, James Broadnax had become someone the people around him described as a source of calm, mentorship, and genuine faith. He had spent years guiding younger inmates through the same system that had swallowed him whole. He prayed for forgiveness, not as a performance, but as something he returned to daily, including for the families of Matthew Butler and Stephen Swan. He had never stopped acknowledging their pain, even while maintaining that he was not the one responsible for it. He had also fallen in love. Just 2 weeks before his execution, he married Tiana Krasniqi, a British law school student, in what must have been one of the most bittersweet moments any two people have ever shared. A wedding with an execution date already written on the calendar. That grief does not have a name. To stand across from someone and make vows about forever, knowing exactly how many days forever has left. To become a husband and a condemned man in the same breath. That is the detail about April 30th that sits heaviest long after everything else fades. His wife was somewhere in that building as the evening approached. His attorneys were present, carrying the weight of everything they had tried and failed to change. And James Broadnax was moving through the final procedures, step by quiet step, toward the moment the state had scheduled. What no procedure on earth could prepare a script for was what he chose to say when that moment finally arrived. The final hours of an execution follow a structure that is both clinical and devastating. The final meal, the final visit, the final walk. Every step has a name, a time, a place in the official record. James Broadnax moved through all of it on the evening of April 30th with a steadiness people around him later noted. His wife could not hold him the way a wife is supposed to hold her husband on the hardest night of their lives. That is the reality of where they were. The goodbye that passed between them in that place belongs to them alone, but the weight of it belongs to anyone willing to sit with it. A woman who had been a wife for 14 days saying a final goodbye to her husband. There is nothing to soften about that. It is exactly as devastating as it sounds. As the clock moved toward the scheduled hour, witnesses were brought in, statements were prepared, and the room that James Broadnax was brought into became the only room in the world that mattered. The man at the center of all of it, who had spent 17 years inside a system that had now made its final decision, was given one last opportunity to speak. James Broadnax did not waste his last words. He turned first to the families of Matthew Butler and Stephen Swan, people who had carried their grief every single day since 2008, people whose loss was real regardless of anything else in this case. He said to them directly, "I prayed to God for your forgiveness. Despite what you think about me, I hope to God that prayer was answered." No theatrics, no performance, just a man in the final minutes of his life reaching across years of pain toward the people on the other side of it, asking for something he knew they might never give. And then he said the part that landed differently on every person in that room. He looked out and said, "No matter what you think about me, Texas got it wrong. I'm innocent. The facts of my case should speak for itself, period." Those were the last words James Broadnax ever said to this world. Not a breakdown, not a rage, just a calm, steady, unwavering statement from a man who had been saying the same thing for 17 years and was still saying it with his last breath. At 6:47 p.m., minutes before 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening in Huntsville, Texas, James Broadnax was pronounced dead. He was 37 years old, the 599th person executed in Texas since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982. The state closed the file. The next scheduled execution in Texas was already on the calendar before the evening was over. The machinery moved forward, because that is what machinery does. But for the people left behind on April 30th, 2026, nothing closed that simply, and the question they are all sitting with is one the official record cannot answer. There are people who will carry this day for the rest of their lives. Tiana, his wife of 2 weeks, who became a widow before she had the chance to become anything else alongside him. His legal team, who spent years fighting through filing after filing, believing they were on the right side of the truth. The 60 religious leaders who signed their names to a letter pleading for pause and watched it change nothing. His cousin Demarius Cummings, who came forward with a confession in what may have been the only honest thing he could bring himself to do, and now has to carry the outcome of that confession for the rest of his sentence. These are the people holding the weight of April 30th long after the official record turned its page. James Broadnax spent 17 years in one of the hardest places a human being can be placed. He came out of it, or rather lived inside it, as someone who prayed, who mentored, who loved, who married, who asked for forgiveness without bitterness, and maintained his innocence without cruelty. Whether the courts processed his case correctly, whether the truth was ever fully examined, whether the right decision was made, those are questions that different people will answer differently, and they will keep answering them for a long time. What is beyond question is the grief of his final day, the morning of waiting, the afternoon of a door closing forever, the evening of a goodbye no one was ready for, The last words of a man who never stopped saying he did not deserve to be there, and the silence that came after 6:47 p.m. in Huntsville, Texas, on April 30th, 2026. Whether the system got it right or not, one question still remains: was justice truly served?